In the decade before the American Civil War, the institution of slavery had reached its most elaborate and systematized form in the Deep South. Alabama, admitted to the Union in 1819, had transformed from frontier territory into one of the wealthiest cotton-producing states in the nation by the 1850s. The Black Belt region, so named for its dark, fertile soil, stretched across the central portion of the state, creating immense wealth for white planters while condemning hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans to lives of forced labor, separation from family, and systematic brutality. By 1853, Alabama's slave population had grown to approximately 342,000 individuals, nearly half the state's total population. These human beings were considered property under the law, bought and sold like livestock, their bodies and labor exploited to fuel the cotton economy that enriched Southern planters and Northern textile manufacturers alike. Yet within this system of total domination, there existed acts of resistance both subtle and dramatic. The story of two enslaved sisters in rural Alabama represents one such act. A moment when desperate vengeance intersected with the everyday violence of slavery, creating an incident that would send ripples through the local community and reveal the depth of anger simmering beneath the surface of plantation life. The plantation system of the antebellum South operated on principles of absolute control and carefully calibrated terror. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their families subject to separation at their owner's whim, their bodies vulnerable to punishment, ranging from whipping to mutilation to death. The legal system offered them no protection. Indeed, the law itself was designed to reinforce their status as property rather than persons. Alabama's slave codes, like those throughout the South, prohibited enslaved people from learning to read or write, from gathering without white supervision, from testifying against white people in court, and from possessing weapons of any kind. Yet resistance persisted in countless forms. Enslaved people engaged in what historians call everyday resistance, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, or quietly sabotaging crops. Some attempted to escape, though the odds of successfully reaching free territory from the Deep South were vanishingly small. Others turned to more desperate measures when pushed beyond endurance. Poison represented one of the few weapons available to enslaved people seeking to strike back against their oppressors. The knowledge of herbs and roots, brought from Africa and supplemented by indigenous American plants, gave some enslaved people access to substances that could sicken or kill. Historical records from the antebellum period document numerous cases of suspected poisoning on Southern plantations. White slaveholders lived in perpetual anxiety about this threat, particularly given their dependence on enslaved people for food preparation and household service. The very intimacy that slavery created, with enslaved people cooking meals, serving drinks, and attending to the most private aspects of their owners' lives, provided opportunities for those desperate or angry enough to take them. Punishment for suspected poisoning was swift and terrible. The legal system provided minimal due process for accused enslaved people, and convictions often rested on circumstantial evidence or coerced confessions extracted through torture. In the spring of 1853, in one of Alabama's Black Belt counties, the historical record preserves varying accounts of the exact location. Two enslaved sisters found themselves driven to an act that would cost them their lives, but would also exact a measure of revenge for wrongs whose specific nature has been lost to history. Though their general character can be readily imagined by anyone familiar with the realities of slavery. The two sisters, their names recorded in some contemporary accounts as Sarah and Lucy, though the historical documentation is frustratingly incomplete, worked as house servants on a substantial plantation in rural Alabama. Contemporary descriptions suggest they were in their 20s, twins or near in age, and had spent their entire lives in bondage. Like most enslaved people, they possessed skills that made them valuable to their owner: cooking, cleaning, sewing, and the countless other tasks required to maintain a plantation household. This work brought them into daily contact with the white family that claimed ownership over them, an intimacy that could be both a burden and, in certain circumstances, an opportunity. The specific grievances that drove these sisters to their desperate act remain unclear in the surviving historical record. Plantation documents from this era rarely recorded the perspectives or motivations of enslaved people with any completeness or accuracy. What is clear from multiple contemporary accounts is that sometime in early 1853, likely in March or April, when the cotton planting season was underway, the sisters determined to poison members of the household that enslaved them. Their weapon of choice was bourbon whiskey, a spirit that had become increasingly popular among Southern planters in this period. The method they employed demonstrated both knowledge and planning. According to trial testimony later recorded in county court documents, the sisters obtained a toxic substance. The specific poison is variously identified in different accounts as arsenic, strychnine, or a preparation derived from poisonous plants native to the region. They introduced this substance into a bottle or decanter of bourbon kept in the plantation house, waiting for the contaminated liquor to be consumed. The plan represented a calculated risk. Discovery would mean certain death, likely by hanging or burning, the usual punishments for enslaved people accused of attempting to murder white people. But the sisters proceeded, nonetheless. The poisoning was discovered relatively quickly, though accounts differ on precisely how the plot came to light. One version of events suggests that a white family member became violently ill after consuming the poisoned bourbon, leading to investigation and the eventual identification of the contaminated bottle. Another account indicates that the sisters were betrayed by another enslaved person on the plantation. Whether through genuine concern, under coercion, or hoping to gain favor with the enslaver remains unknown. A third version claims that the sisters themselves were observed acting suspiciously near the bourbon supply, leading to questioning and eventual confession. What followed was grimly predictable given the time and place. The sisters were seized and subjected to interrogation. The methods used to extract confessions from enslaved people accused of crimes against white people in the antebellum South were brutal and explicit. Whipping, burning, and other forms of torture were routinely employed, and confessions obtained under such duress were nevertheless considered valid evidence in the perfunctory legal proceedings that passed for trials in such cases. Whether the sisters confessed immediately or only after physical coercion, whether they expressed remorse or defiance, whether they revealed accomplices or claimed to have acted alone, these details are lost to history or were never recorded with accuracy. The legal process moved swiftly. Alabama law in 1853 provided for special slave courts to handle cases involving enslaved defendants accused of serious crimes against white people. These tribunals offered none of the protections that would have been afforded to white defendants. No presumption of innocence protected the accused. No right to competent legal counsel existed. No meaningful opportunity to present evidence or call witnesses in one's defense was provided. The proceedings were designed to reach predetermined conclusions with a veneer of legal formality. The sisters were convicted of attempted murder, or in some accounts, actual murder, if any white family member died from the poisoning, though the historical record is contradictory on this crucial point. The sentence was death, as was mandatory for enslaved people convicted of attempting to kill white people. The method of execution would have been hanging, carried out publicly as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of resistance. The case of the twin sisters and the poisoned bourbon illuminates several crucial aspects of slave society in the antebellum South. First, it demonstrates the constant tension beneath the surface of plantation life. White slaveholders maintained their dominance through overwhelming force and legal sanction, yet they lived in perpetual awareness of their vulnerability. The very structure of slavery, which required enslaved people to work in close proximity to their oppressors, handling their food and drink, accessing their private spaces, created opportunities for resistance that no amount of surveillance could entirely eliminate. Second, the incident reveals the limited options available to enslaved people seeking to resist or escape their condition. By 1853, the slave system had been refined and hardened over decades. Escape from the Deep South was extraordinarily difficult. Open rebellion was suicidal, given the overwhelming force arrayed against any uprising. Legal channels offered no recourse whatsoever. In such circumstances, desperate acts like poisoning represented one of the few available means of striking back, however dangerous and ultimately futile such actions might prove. The case also illuminates the gendered dimensions of slavery and resistance. Enslaved women faced particular vulnerabilities within the system, including sexual exploitation by white men and the constant threat of having their children sold away from them. Women working as house servants had access to opportunities for resistance unavailable to those laboring in the fields, but they also worked under closer supervision and constant scrutiny. The decision of these two sisters to attempt poisoning their enslavers, assuming the historical accounts are accurate in their basic outline, represents a form of resistance that drew on their positions within the household while fully recognizing the near certainty of detection and death. The immediate aftermath of the poisoning attempt sent waves of fear and suspicion through the local planting community. News of such incidents spread quickly among white slaveholders, reinforcing their anxieties about the loyalty and docility of the people they enslaved. In response, plantations often instituted tighter controls, more frequent searches of slave quarters, stricter supervision of food preparation, heightened surveillance of enslaved people's movements and interactions. The execution of the sisters would have been carried out publicly, with enslaved people from surrounding plantations forced to witness the grim spectacle as a warning against similar acts of resistance. For the enslaved community, the incident and its aftermath carried different meanings. While public executions were intended to terrorize and dissuade resistance, they could also serve as occasions for collective mourning and silent solidarity. The sisters' act, however desperate and ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that even under the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit could refuse to submit entirely. Their story would have been remembered and retold in the slave quarters, perhaps celebrated quietly as an act of defiance, perhaps mourned as a tragic waste, perhaps both simultaneously. The broader significance of this incident extends beyond its immediate time and place. Cases like this one, scattered throughout the historical record of American slavery, reveal the lie at the heart of pro-slavery ideology. Southern apologists claimed that enslaved people were content with their condition, that slavery was a benevolent institution that cared for an inferior race incapable of self-governance. Every act of resistance, from work slowdowns to escape attempts to desperate acts of violence, gave witness to the truth that slavery was maintained only through force and terror, that it violated the fundamental human desire for freedom and dignity, and that it created relationships of mutual hatred rather than the paternalistic affection that slaveholders claimed. The story of the twin sisters and their act of desperate vengeance was not unique in the annals of American slavery. Across the South, in countless instances both documented and lost to history, enslaved people sought ways to resist their condition and strike back at their oppressors. Some acts of resistance were individual and violent, like the poisoning we have just examined. Others took collective forms, from the everyday resistance of slowed work and subtle sabotage to the organized revolts that periodically shook the South with terror. As we continue our examination of this dark chapter in American history, we will explore the broader patterns of resistance and control that characterized slave society in the years leading up to the Civil War. The tensions that drove two sisters to poison their enslavers' bourbon were emblematic of larger forces building throughout the South, forces that would eventually tear the nation apart in the bloodiest conflict in American history. But before we turn to those larger patterns, we must understand the daily realities of life under slavery, the mechanisms of control, the strategies of survival, and the countless acts of resistance, both large and small, through which enslaved people asserted their humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it.